Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media, while we live in a fracturing society launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum. I remain in the underclass. How long can we stand idly by while the true intentions of our ruling class remain beyond the veil of public scrutiny? Endless examples of the deliberate demise of our social ethics, intentionally unraveling the moral fabric and placing us on a path to complete societal collapse. False narratives, consistently disseminated through the hidden hand of clandestine operators designed to conceal the very existence of the deep state. What freedom are we to find when we are enslaved under the chains of human trafficking? How do we finally expose and eradicate these depraved patterns of behavior, inherently perpetuating the sadistic cycle of abuse? This week, we catch another glimpse of what lies beneath as we stumble upon a window into the shadowy global elite, shedding light on the undeniable exploitation of the most vulnerable among us. In our effort to draw back the curtain of deception intended to disguise the true dynamics of power, we're confronted with the active suppression of the most formidable evil. The beast of Belgium serves as a symbol of the malignant cancer disrupting all of global society, ultimately revealing a system that intentionally punishes victims and protects predators.
Toute la Belgique recherche ses enfants.
The whole of Belgium was searching for the kids.
Connaît Dutroux.
And the gendarmerie knows Dutroux, with his past as a child abuser. They know he's building suspect hiding places in some of his houses. And yet, for some totally incomprehensible reason, Marc Dutroux wasn't arrested.
Belgians begin to ask whether Marc Dutroux is being protected by powerful people within the state. While in custody, Dutroux himself fans the flames of conspiracy with a controversial claim which will forever change the global perception of this case. He states he is part of a national paedophile network whose tentacles stretch right to the top of Belgian society. Investigating judge Jean-Marc Connerot is put in charge of preparing the case against Dutroux. He is determined to get the truth. Connerot arrests known associates of Dutroux. One of these is Michel Nihoul, a well-connected Brussels businessman and pub owner.
He's a part of this scene of sex parties in Brussels in the early 80s. He's the kind of guy telling stories about tapes that allow him to blackmail a minister, being involved in some kind of crime.
After a public appeal, 11 previous victims of Dutroux come forward. They are known as X-witnesses, and each is given a code name. X1 is Regina Louf.
I saw him on TV and all these people yelling at him, and it was a very strange experience for me.
Regina Louf, now a mother of 4, recognizes Marc Dutroux and Michel Nihoul from her childhood.
My mother had a boyfriend, and he hired me again to other men to sort of a prostitution network, and there I met Nihoul. So these parties were organized for other pedophiles, and there they took 1 to several children, and they had sex with them, of course, or they took photographs or films or making movies, everything. The people who were going to these parties were big businessmen. There were also politicians.
A Accompanying Nihoul at these parties, according to Regina, was Marc Dutroux. If this story is true, Connerot appears to have stumbled upon evidence that a paedophile network involving Dutroux, Nihoul, and powerful people in Belgian society does indeed exist. It falls to Rudy Hoskins to investigate the claims of Regina Louf.
She talked about lots of people, a lot of notorious people in Belgium, could be politicians or people from corporates, stuff like that. Also people from the police. It's difficult to say what the first impression was. It was a young woman with quite some problems, I think, in her head, honestly. Yeah.
That they are skeptical, I think it's logical. But the only thing I asked from them was to do their job and to look for clues.
Then Regina Louf provides extensive details of the unsolved murder of 15-year-old Christina van Hees, whose body was discovered in a disused farm on the outskirts of Brussels in 1984.
We found evidence in the old murder file about the autopsy of the corpse that corroborated her story. The way the victim was bound with the hands on the back and all kind of stuff they did to the victim. And there were really things she gave in her interview that were not publicly made available at the time of the murders that she told us.
Regina Louf's information on the Van Hees murder persuades Hoskins that maybe there is some truth in the rest of her testimony.
If there's only 10% or 20%, that's worthwhile investigating further. I think that's, for me, it's very clear.
But the implications of this testimony are also clear. A paedophile network of rich clients and criminals, protected by the authorities.
There's a big danger if she's right about the crime, the motives of the crime and the way it has been committed. She might be right about the suspects as well. I think people in some level were afraid of that.
However, Judge Connerot's investigation into Regina Louf's claim of the existence of a powerful paedophile network is suddenly brought to a halt. In October 1996, he is sacked. His attendance at a dinner thrown by the families of Dutroux's victims is deemed a conflict of interest by his superiors in the Ministry of Justice. Rudy Hoskins and the team working with the ex-witnesses are summoned to the Justice Department.
We were just informed during that meeting that already, as from today, you stop your investigation. And that was it. We were going too far for some people. Don't ask me who, I have no idea, and why, no idea. I still ask myself the same question, but we touched upon something that was not supposed to get out in the open.
Connerot's dismissal has a devastating effect on public confidence in the Dutroux investigation.
I am covering criminal investigations in this country for 15 years. I can give you hundreds of names of judges having dinner with victims, with lawyers, with suspects. This happens all the time.
In Connerot heb ik
I always
altijd
believed in
geloofd.
Connerot. This stank and still stinks, in my opinion.
Altijd, vind ik.
Hundreds of thousands of Belgians agree. On the 20th of October 1996, national outrage boils over at a huge march organized by the families of Dutroux's victims.
There was a sense of total disbelief, a sense of revolt, a sense of this can't go any further like this.
300,000 people march through Brussels. Workers across the country go on strike, and firemen turn their hoses on government buildings to symbolically cleanse official corruption. Belgium stands on the brink of revolution.
Sordid Times in Dear Belgium, written by Charles Trueheart and published September 24th, 1996, describes 4 little girls kidnapped for the sex trade are exhumed from the dungeon prisons that became their tombs. A political leader and his henchmen are arrested for the contract murder of a government official. A child prostitution ring is exposed, and every day brings new hints of official cover-ups, police bungling, tampered evidence, and judicial incompetence. What country are we living in? Asked a headline in a Brussels newspaper as it delivered yet another day of sickening and sinister news. The answer is Belgium, where the Dutch and French-speaking populations coexist uneasily in a single Maryland-sized kingdom pinched uncomfortably among France, the Netherlands, Germany, and Luxembourg. The most mafia-ridden banana republic, lamented the paper, looks like an island of tranquility next to our Belgium of deviance and murderous plots, our dear Belgium that we no longer recognize. In this hour, the woe is not extravagant. Across Belgium, the rear windows of cars are plastered with photos of Julie Lujan and Melissa Russo, two 8-year-olds whose bodies were dug up in late August after police in Charleroi arrested the man who kidnapped them, a convicted child rapist named Marc Dutroux. In early September, Dutroux led them to the buried bodies of two teenagers, Anne Marshall and Afia Lambrix, who had been missing for a year. Police said Dutroux was part of a child prostitution ring that may also have been responsible for several other disappearances still unsolved. His gang allegedly offered to buy young victims for $5,000 apiece. As part-time car thieves, too, they may have enjoyed local police protection. 2 weeks ago, even as Belgians mourned the children, and the drip of grisly details from the Dutroux case continued, police arrested Alain van der Biest, a powerful regional official from French-speaking Wallonia, in the unsolved 1991 assassination of André Kuhls, a one-time deputy prime minister. The dramatic reopening of the 5-year-old Kuhls case stunned a country already deep in grief. The apparent earlier mishandling of the case by the police and courts, Van der Biest had been suspected and investigated after the contract hit on Kuhls, but never prosecuted. It stirred very recent memories of official corruption among the political elites who run this country of 11 million. Payoffs to Belgian politicians by an Italian helicopter manufacturer in exchange for military contracts ended the careers of several cabinet ministers and the Belgian Secretary General of NATO, Willy Claus, last year. Claus denied being involved in improper activities. A dark riposte making the rounds here goes, "How are you doing?" Answer, "Better than Belgium." King Albert, who rarely intervenes in matters of state, took the extraordinary step recently of speaking out on the current traumas. He told his people that, like them, he expects the elected government to get to the bottom of the crimes and to reform the legal and penal processes that made them possible. While Belgians still revere the king, public trust in police and judges has fallen almost to 1%, according to an unscientific television survey. Politicians, feeling defensive, prefer to describe the public mood as a loss of confidence in institutions. One of them, Prime Minister Jean-Luc Dehaene, addressed Parliament last Thursday and vowed to do all that the king had asked and more to depoliticize the judiciary and clean up the government. Dehaene pledged to beef up Belgium's penalties against sex crimes and crimes against children, to reform the penal and parole systems, and to provide greater assistance to victims of sex crimes. The Dutroux case may have nothing to do with the Kuhls assassination, but Belgians see them as parts of a single blot on the national image. The sickness, the cancer, a Brussels shopkeeper said, shaking her head as she took a broom to her front steps, and it's still spreading. For some disgusted Belgians, the timing of the revelations, one after another, suggests connections between them. Did the Dutroux investigation turn up new evidence that led to Van der Biest's arrest? A man on a red motorcycle fired the shots that killed Kuhls in a parking lot. Was it the same red motorcycle found in Dutroux' garage? And didn't one of Dutroux' accomplices formerly live with a woman who later took up with a close associate of Vanderbiest? Something is rotten in the state of Belgium, writes investigative journalist Olenka Frankiel in May of 2002, 6 years after the arrest of Marc Dutroux, the country's notorious pedophile. No date has been set for his trial, and the case remains painfully unresolved. In 1995, when two 8-year-old girls were kidnapped, Dutroux, a convicted sex offender, was the prime suspect from the start, yet he wasn't arrested for 14 months. By that time, 4 of his captives, including the 2 girls, were dead. Since his arrest, 20 potential witnesses connected with the case have died in mysterious circumstances, fueling suspicions of a cover-up reaching the highest levels. Frankiel explains that early on, she was told by one senior government advisor, "You must not underestimate the terrible record of our Belgian justice system. It's a system which today appears paralyzed, unable to prosecute the accused, his wife, and an alleged accomplice. With each successive year in jail without trial, their case against the Belgian authorities for a breach of human rights grows stronger. The official explanation for the delay is that hysterical conspiracy theories forced investigators to search for pedophile networks which didn't exist. But far from being investigated, leads pointing to a network seem rather to have been ignored or buried. Dutroux' wife, Michelle Martin, a former primary school teacher and the mother of his 3 children, has admitted that in 1995, she knew 2 small girls were incarcerated without food or water in a secret dungeon in the cellar of a house they owned in Charleroi. She told police she visited the house to feed their dogs while her husband was in jail on car theft charges, but she was too frightened to feed the girls. Months later, Dutroux led police to the emaciated bodies of Julie Lujan and Melissa Russo, the 2 8-year-olds who had been kidnapped more than a year before. They were buried in the garden of another of Dutroux' homes. An accomplice, Michel Lelièvre, a drug addict and petty thief, told police soon after his arrest that the girls had been kidnapped to order for someone else. The chief suspect was Jean-Michel Nihoul, a Brussels businessman, pub owner, and familiar face at sex parties. While they had been in prison, Lelièvre told police Dutroux and Nihoul met frequently in the exercise yard making plans. The judge investigating the case, Jean-Marc Connerat, believed Nihoul was the brains behind the operation. But as the network began to unravel, Lelièvre suddenly stopped cooperating, saying he had been threatened. Frankiel claims that she met Nihoul in a restaurant in Brussels. "I am the monster of Belgium," he roared at me by way of greeting. He is confident he will never come to trial, and that the evidence against him will never be heard by any jury. During the course of our meal, he apparently playfully grabbed me, tickling, and finally pulled me over onto him in the restaurant booth until I had to appeal to my colleagues for rescue. "He will never come to court," he said, "because the information he has about important people in Belgium would bring the government down. The monster of Belgium denies he's a pedophile, but seemed to enjoy the notoriety and demanded 1,000 francs for his story. We declined his offer, but we did need to offer Nihoul a right to reply to the accusations made by Regina Louf, a woman now aged 33, whose testimony has divided Belgium. Louf came forward after Judge Connerat made an appeal to victims of pedophiles to tell police what they knew. Connerat, the man who had arrested Dutroux and saved 2 teenage girls from his dungeon, was a hero in Belgium. Louf was the first of 10 to come forward. She told investigators how, from the age of 12, she'd been given by her parents to a family friend, Tony Vanden Bogert, who had had a key to their house. He would collect her from school and take her away for weekends to sex parties where she was given to other men and secretly filmed having sex with them. It was highly organized, she says. Big business. blackmail. There was a lot of money involved. In 1996, she related her experiences to a police team under carefully filmed and supervised conditions. She described certain regular clients, including judges, one of the country's most powerful politicians, and a prominent banker. She gave the police the names by which she knew these men, detailed the houses, apartments, and districts where she'd been taken with other children to entertain the guests. This entertainment was not just sex, she told the police. It involved sadism, torture, and even murder. And again she described the places, the victims, and the way they were killed. One of the regular organizers of these parties, she claimed, was the man she knew as Mich, Jean-Michel Nihoul, a very cruel man. He abused children in a very sadistic way, she said. Also there, she said, was the young Dutroux. Dutroux was a boy who brought drugs, cocaine to these parties. He brought some girls, watched girls. At these events, Nihoul was a sort of party beast, while Dutroux was more on the side. Louf's testimony was vitally important. If true, it placed Dutroux and Nihoul, suspected accomplices in the latest child abductions, together at the scene of similar crimes 10 years before. Police began to check her story, but then something changed. In October 1996, Connerat, the only man who has ever advanced the Dutroux investigation, was sacked from the case. He had attended a fundraising dinner in support of the victims' families and was accused of a conflict of interests. A crowd of 400,000 marched on the Palace of Justice in Brussels to protest. The father of one of the murdered children, Gino Russo, spoke for the demonstrators. It was like spitting on the grave of Julie and Melissa, he said. Connerat was replaced by Judge Jacques Langlois, for whom this case would be his first assignment. Langlois had spent the last 5 years in constant conflict with the public prosecutor assigned with him to the case, Michel Bourlet. Since Connerat was sacked, according to the Russos, the Dutroux file has acquired no new evidence. Next to be dismissed a few months later was the special team of police officers who had interviewed Louf and the other witnesses. By now, the police believed they had verified key elements of Louf's story. At least one of the murders she described matched an unsolved case. One of the police officers in the team, Rudy Hoskins, had been assigned to re-examine that case and was convinced she had witnessed the murder. She gave us some details that made us think it's impossible to give without having been there at that place. The way the body was found at that time, and the way she described the person who was killed. What Louf had described was a macabre torture which had eventually killed a 15-year-old girl she knew as Chrissy. It was a sort of bondage, she told me. So her legs and her hands and her throat were connected with the same rope, and so when she moved, she strangled herself. Louf insists both Nihoul and Dutroux were there that night. Nihoul, she claims, took part in the murder, a charge he denies. Dutroux, she says, watched. Christine Van Heese's body had been found in 1984, dumped in the grounds of a disused mushroom farm on the outskirts of Brussels. The farm was later demolished, but in 1996, Louf described to the police team its intricate details: the wallpaper, the sinks, hooks on the ceiling, the network of stairs and adjoining rooms unique to that building. When I put this evidence to Anne Tilly, Prosecutor General of Liege, in overall charge of the Dutroux affair, she gave me a shrug and repeated the official line in Belgium, that Louf is a fantasist and has invented everything. This is not the view of the man who grew up at that farm, the son of the former owner, who showed me photographs of the house and the mushroom factory. He said, "I've never met Regina Louf. All I know is that she could not have described the house as well as she did unless she'd been there. It was two houses joined together in a strange way. It would be impossible to invent it. For 12 years, the unsolved murder of Van Hees gathered dust in the Brussels files under the direction of Judge Van Espen. 2 years ago, a Belgian journalist revealed the close relationship between Judge Van Espen and Nihul and his then wife. As a lawyer, Van Espen had represented Nihul's wife. Van Espen's sister was the godmother of Nihul's child. Yet, when Loof accused these two of the murder, Judge Van Espen saw no conflict of interest, no reason to resign. Nor was he sacked, as Conrad had been. Instead, he was allowed to order the police officers to stay out of the case. Van Espen only resigned as the judge in charge of the mushroom factory investigation in early 1998, after his relationship with Nihul was exposed. In the spring of 1997, Loof's interrogators had been sent home without explanation, and a new team was assigned to reread her testimony. The press was briefed that the previous team had been removed because they had manipulated the evidence of Loof, who was then known by the code name X1. It is a charge which the police team has always vigorously denied and which has never been substantiated. And then the media campaign began. Loof's name was leaked to the press. The government-owned TV station RTBF began a campaign designed to prove that Dutroux was an isolated pervert, kidnapping girls for himself, that there was no network, that Nihul was innocent, and Loof was a liar. Belgium's flagship current affairs television program, Au Nom de la Loi, floated Loof's face over a backdrop of crows pecking over debris orchestrated by a Blair Witch-style soundtrack. Her aging parents appeared as tragic victims of a deranged fantasist whose false memories had blighted their last years. What the program makers knew, but didn't say, was that the parents had already admitted to police that a family friend in his 40s, Tony Vanden Bogert, had had a key to their home and unlimited access to their 12-year-old daughter. Nor did they tell their viewers that Vanden Bogert had himself admitted his relationship with Loof to police. Vanden Bogert lives freely on the borders of Belgium and Holland, unmolested by the law or the press. Au Nom de la Loi has never attempted to track him down and expose this self-confessed pedophile. Instead, they have devoted hours of airtime to destroying the name of his victim, Loof, whose only offense appears to be that she was prepared to testify about the organized abuse she'd suffered as a child. This campaign has succeeded. Judges have announced that Loof will not be called as a witness in any future trial of Dutroux or his associates. Her testimony and that of all the 10 witnesses who came forward to Judge Connerat has been declared worthless. No one has ever followed the Dutroux investigation more closely than Gino and Corinne Russo, the parents of Melissa. What alarms them more than anything is the dearth of evidence or independent witnesses in the whole affair. The Russos have access to the dossier of evidence which will eventually be presented to a jury. What alarms them, they say, is that it contains little more than the highly suspect version of events offered by Dutroux and his wife. This is crucial because while Dutroux admits incarcerating their daughter in his home, he denies her kidnap, rape, or murder. Dutroux even claims he tried in vain to save the girls and that Melissa died in his arms. The Russos have lived this nightmare ever since Melissa disappeared with her friend Julie in June 1995. Although Dutroux was a known pedophile, police didn't search his house for 5 months, and when they did, they failed to find the girls, despite the sound of children in the cellar. When a parliamentary commission examined the series of failures in the Dutroux investigation, the police officer responsible, René Michaud, claimed it was a genuine mistake, that the entrance to the dungeon was well hidden, and that the children's voices seemed to come from outside. He found a speculum on the floor which he lifted, handled, and returned to Dutroux's wife without forensic analysis. They found films which went undeveloped and videos which they didn't watch. Had they done so, they would have seen Dutroux building the dungeon. Instead, Dutroux continued to abduct girls. In August 1996, 4 days after his last kidnap, he was arrested. He showed police the dungeon from where 2 girls were freed, and then he led them to where Melissa and Julie were buried. Corinne Russo was not allowed to see her daughter's body. I begged and pleaded. I went with my lawyer, but they refused. They told me the law did not permit it. But who will identify my daughter? I asked them. Who will confirm that it's her? Dutroux has identified her, they told me. It is stupefying, she says. The autopsy report reveals Melissa was raped repeatedly over a prolonged period. There is nothing, no DNA evidence, no witness sightings, no forensics of any kind to show whether it was Dutroux or anyone else. Corinne Russo points to a wall of files in her office. Where are the results of the swabs taken from Melissa's body for analysis? We know swabs were taken. It says so in the reports. But there are no results. I've asked the prosecutor repeatedly, and no one seems to know. After their years of grief and their betrayal by the Belgian police and judiciary, the Russos barely believe a word of the official version. That Dutroux, the lone pedophile, kidnapped the girls for his personal use and kept them in the cage in his cellar until their death of starvation the day he returned home after 4 months in jail. How, they ask, could 2 children survive alone with virtually no food or water for 4 months? The Russos suspect the girls weren't there at all. A number of reported sightings of Melissa, one in an upstairs room of a Charleroi nightclub, which were never followed up, have convinced them that someone else had access to the girls while Dutroux was in jail. Why else, they ask, were the hairs which detectives gathered from the dungeon in Dutroux's cellar never sent for DNA analysis? Why did Judge Langlois, Honorit's replacement, refuse to have them tested despite pressure from his prosecutor Michel Bourlet, who believed that a DNA identification of those hairs might reveal who else was involved? Langlois' boss, the prosecutor general of Liège, Anne Tilly, says there was no need to get the hairs analyzed, as no one else entered the cage. There was no network, so there was no need to look for evidence of one. Marc Dutroux is a homicidal pedophile and rapist who was initially convicted for the abduction and rape of 5 young girls in 1989 before being released on parole after only serving 3 years in prison. Not long after his release in 1996, he was arrested again on suspicion of having abducted, tortured, and sexually abused 6 girls between the ages of 8 and 19 years old. This time, 4 of the girls had been murdered. The story of Marc Dutroux involves the procurement of children, overlapping threads of satanic ritual abuse, spirit cooking networks, and a federally sponsored systematic cover-up. In October 1996, more than 300,000 Belgians marched through the streets of Brussels in a protest called the White March, wearing signs that read, "Stop the cover-up," after the judge was removed from the case for attending a fundraising dinner for the families of the victims, which the court claimed damaged his impartiality. Press reports explained that prior to his removal, Judge Connerat was on the verge of publicly disclosing the names of high-level government officials who had been recognized on videotapes. He also had said that the wealthy and politically connected prominent businessman Michel Nihoul was the brains behind the child kidnapping operation and would testify in the trial that there had been high-level murder plots to stop his investigation. Conveniently, the judge who was then appointed to replace him happened to have direct ties to Michel Nihoul, the very same lead co-defendant accused of said charges. A report in the Washington Post even claimed that investigators believed that Dutroux and Nihoul were deeply involved with the planning for a long-distance prostitution trafficking network involving fleets of cars and the import of girls from Slovakia. There were 500 civilian witnesses involved in the trial, and out of the 500, 60 witnesses disappeared, and another 30 were murdered in various ways. There were police officers that had been on the case from the beginning, who were found dead in their homes due to apparent suicide with their own service revolvers, and even a prosecutor was found shot in the head in his office. At least 7 members of law enforcement were arrested on suspicion of having ties to Marc Dutroux, and one of them was a police detective believed to be an associate of Dutroux. The Chicago Tribune reported that Belgian Senator Anne-Marie Lizin commented on the case, saying, "Stupidity by the police can't be the only explanation. It's a question of stupidity, incompetence, and corruption. Dutroux must be a friend of somebody important, or else he was being protected because he was known to be a police informant." Lizin said Dutroux was not a true pedophile as he has been portrayed. He had a record of dealing in stolen cars, selling arms to hoodlums, and trafficking in prostitution. When he discovered that men paid a lot more for little girls for prostitution, he started kidnapping them, she said. When Dutroux finally was arrested, police found in his house videos of him raping little girls. They said he did this so he could sell the films to pedophiles. During Dutroux's testimony, he claimed that he was a low dog in a powerful pedophile network. He further claimed that Michel Nihoul was the organizer of their abductions. He denied being a murderer, but he did confess to killing one of his accomplices, Bernard Weinstein, by burying him alive for letting the girls die due to starvation while Dutroux had spent 4 months in prison for vehicle theft. The girls were 8-year-old classmates Julie and Melissa, who had been kidnapped after going for a walk and brought to Dutroux's house where he kept them imprisoned in the dungeon he had created, repeatedly sexually abusing them and producing child pornography videos of the abuse. August 23, 1995, 2 months later, Dutroux and at least one accomplice kidnapped 2 teenage girls, Anne Marshall and Afia Lambrix, who were on their way back home following a night out. Since 8-year-old Julie and Melissa were already in the dungeon, Lambrix and Marshall were kept in chains in a bedroom where they were drugged and repeatedly abused. Dutroux's wife and accomplice, Michelle Martin, claimed that in September, Lambrix and Marshall were once again drugged. This time, they were brought to another one of the properties where Dutroux and Weinstein buried them alive. According to Dutroux and ex-wife Michelle Martin, 8-year-old Julie and Melissa were still alive in the dungeon at the time of Dutroux's arrest in December 1995, and Dutroux had ordered Michelle to leave new food and water for the girls each time they ran out. She later claimed that she was too afraid to go into the dungeon, and the girls eventually starved to death. Their autopsies later revealed that the girls had been raped during the period of time that Dutroux was in prison. He said that he did torture and abuse all of the girls, but denied killing any of them until the very end. He also denied kidnapping, raping, and murdering 8-year-old Julie and Melissa. However, he admitted to incarcerating them at one of his properties. I should mention that Dutroux owned 10 houses, yet somehow received thousands of dollars in public assistance from the federal government of Belgium. In 2009, WikiLeaks published the Dutroux dossier, which revealed that large sums of money in different currencies had arrived in Dutroux's wife Michelle Martin's bank account and claimed to be linked in time to the disappearances of the abducted girls. Belgian authorities initially tried to have the dossier taken down, to no avail, and both the transfers and the value of the 6 properties that Dutroux owned suggested to investigators that he was financed by a larger pedophile and prostitution ring. A newspaper reported that he had committed theft, insurance fraud, and suspicious investments in the stock market, which had contributed to his wealth, instantly reminding me of the numerous lottery fraud scandals connected to one Jeffrey Epstein. During Dutroux's testimony, he claimed that 2 unidentified policemen had taken part with him in the kidnapping of Anne Marshall and Afia Lambrix. He even reportedly boasted about having built the dungeon in which Marshall and Lambrix were held for a while. He said, I wanted to create a hiding place to spare them from being sent to a prostitution ring, a powerful and sinister child sex ring. Dutroux admitted to raping Lambrix. He said that Weinstein had raped Marshall. He also admitted to drugging both of them. He later admitted to kidnapping and raping 2 other girls and not handing them over to Nihul to spare them the fate of Marshall and Lambrix. After the 2 8-year-old girls, Julie and Melissa, were kidnapped in June 1995, it took police 14 months to arrest Dutroux, even after executing 2 raids at Dutroux's house where the girls were being held, without finding them, once on the 13th and once on the 19th of December 1995. Before all of this occurred, Dutroux's own mother had tipped off authorities, writing a letter stating that she knew Dutroux had kidnapped 2 girls and was keeping them in his basement. According to ex-Scotland Yard detective constable turned whistleblower John Wedger, a Metropolitan Police child protection specialist who uncovered a well-hidden and organized child prostitution network in London and the UK, what really happened when the police raided Marc Dutroux's house was that a certain officer was strategically placed in charge, and upon discovering hundreds of videos, this officer swiftly seized them, refusing to allow anyone else to view them. He then proceeded to quickly sort through the videos, marking them with an X for destruction, causing much of the video evidence to disappear. During the search of the property, they went into the basement where the locksmith, along with other officers present at the scene, claimed to hear young girls' voices calling for help, and this lead officer shouted the word, "Silent!" All went quiet, and he said, "No, there's nothing here." What the other officers failed to realize was that during this search, when they were taking the videos off of the bookcase, it was actually a false bookcase, and just behind that wall was a dungeon with the 2 girls who would starve to death. John Wedger claims that this lead officer knew those girls were behind that wall, yet he covered it up. The same officer would conveniently receive a promotion the very next month. Thousands of hairs were found in the dungeon where the 2 girls were held, but the judge refused to have them tested for DNA evidence, even though the leading police investigator had begged him to have them analyzed in order to know whether more people besides Dutroux were involved. Around the same time, there happened to be a police raid on a property owned by a satanic cult located in Belgium. Confronting an atrocity, the Dutroux case, is the title of a 1998 report from the Child and Woman Abuse Studies Unit, or CWASU, and describes Jean-Michel Nihul as the commercial organizer of the sexual exploitation. When questioned, he admitted to organizing sex parties at Belgian castles, which included VIP guests. He offered this and other evidence in the hope that he would not be prosecuted, but the prosecutor and Judge Connerat had refused to make any deal with him. One press report published in the Sunday Express, December 1st, 1997, referred to suspected links between Dutroux and the self-styled Satanic Order of Abrasacs based in southern Belgium. A letter found in the house of accomplice Bernard Weinstein, who Dutroux admits he drugged and buried alive, referred to the group and to the need to continue to procure presents in the form of human beings for Anubis, the high priestess of the order. The media were asked to withhold this information for many months. A raid on the group temple, an anonymous cottage, resulted in seizure of hundreds of videotapes, racks of computer disks, 2 human skulls, and jars of blood. Tuesday, December 24th, 1996, the Irish Times published an article claiming that police investigating a Belgian gang accused of child sexual abuse and murder raided the headquarters of a satanic sect over the weekend looking for clues, RTBF television reported. It said 150 police and special investigators raided the headquarters of the Institut Abrasacs in Forquy-le-Marchie, near the central Belgium city of Charleroi on Saturday night. The television showed police taking away bags of papers, video cassettes, and a refrigerator. It said they also took away black magic ritual implements and human skulls. RTBF said the raid had been prompted by the discovery of an undated letter addressed to someone named Bernard, asking him to remind someone else that a special ceremony was approaching and to remember a special gift. The letter was signed by Anubis, an ancient Egyptian god and the assumed name of the high priestess of the Abrasac sect. A Frenchman, Bernard Weinstein, was an accomplice of a gang led by a convicted rapist, Marc Dutroux, who has admitted killing him. Weinstein's body was found alongside those of 8-year-olds Julie Lugin and Melissa Russo in mid-August, buried on a property belonging to Dutroux in the town of Sars-le-Bussier, southwest of Charleroi. The two girls abducted in June 1995 had starved to death earlier this year. Dominic Kindermans, the high priestess of the sect, said that to her knowledge, neither Dutroux nor Weinstein had ever been members of or connected with Abrasacs. A spokesman for gendarmes, the police force searching an abandoned mine complex in nearby Jumet, a suburb of Charleroi, refused to comment on any link between the Abrasacs raid and their own hunt for a secret hiding place they are convinced Dutroux had in the mine for abducted children. Found during the raid were letters to Dutroux and his murdered accomplice Weinstein, along with additional paperwork linking Dutroux to this satanic cult, even going into detail, stating that victims were stripped naked, chased into the woods by dogs, and then subjected to torture and orgies. Another victim of similar abuse, Darren Jeffries, described being taken with a group of children to Rainbow Wood, located in Bath in the UK. Once there, saints of the cult groups would take part in a ritualized tribute they call the Chase, where he would be stripped naked, and they would be chased by men and dogs. Once they were captured, they would be tortured, sodomized, and some of the children even died there. The Chase is allegedly a tribute to the biblical Moloch, or child sacrifice, presented in some forms as an owl. The idea is that an owl doesn't just catch a mouse and eat it. The owl will capture a mouse and then let it go. It gives its prey a sense of freedom before tormenting and killing it. It has since been revealed that Weinstein and Dutroux were not only procuring children for sex, but for satanic ritual abuse. Weinstein and Dutroux stood under High Priestess Anubis of the Satanic Order of Abrasacs in southern Belgium, which was later verified through a police investigation that went public. An article published in The Independent with the title, "Dutroux says he abducted girls with police help," explains that Dutroux's lawyer said during the trial proceedings, "I speak not only as a lawyer, but also as a citizen and father. He was not the only devil." Out of the 6,000 hair samples that were found in the basement cellar where some of the victims were held, 25 unknown DNA profiles were discovered. There were people in that cellar that are not now accused. Prosecution never attempted to match those DNA profiles to people implicated in the case. The girls that survived were mentioning people they had seen on television, prominent politicians and established members of the Catholic clergy. John Wedger also claims to have good information on a member of the clergy who was involved in the killing of two of the girls at a party by impaling them internally on a concrete dildo. This is the sadistic level of depravity involved in such an enterprise. More examples of this disturbing abuse can be found at the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Covert Politics, which provide details of victim witness accounts found in the Dutroux dossier, reporting that probably the most important and underreported thing that happened in the aftermath of the Dutroux affair was that a number of victims from pedophile networks felt that this was their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to testify about what they had experienced. Until Connerat and Borlée were able to arrest Dutroux and Nihul and retrieve two missing girls, these victim witnesses did not know who in the Justice Department they could trust. Many of these victims already had tried to speak to the authorities, but investigations never got off the ground. The victims knew the reason. Among their abusers were the most powerful men in Belgium: police commissioners, gendarme officers, judges, bankers, businessmen, politicians, and high nobility figures. Not all, but most of these victims who came to Neuchâtel to testify about the network were designated with an X followed by a number. Victim Regina Louf, or X1, suffered from MPD-DID, multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder. She told how many of her alters, or alternative personalities, still had the same age as when they were created, or how her handwriting differed depending on which alter was active. As is obvious from her background of extreme abuse, these symptoms started at an early age, and interestingly, her pimp not only wasn't surprised when he first encountered X1's alters, he actually cultivated them. DID was created in X1 because of her background of extreme abuse. But what did this abuse actually involve? First, there was the psychological aspect. X1 never received any support or love from her parents, her grandmother, Tony, who was her primary abuser, or any of her other abusers. Especially Tony and the grandmother who acted as her pimps. They indoctrinated X1 with the belief that she was a nobody. Besides Tony, nobody cared about a little whore like her. She was too stupid to become anything else than a prostitute, and that love is something you never get for free. Furthermore, X1 was blamed for just about anything that happened to her, to other children in the network, to her pets, or even to those who abused her. For example, if X1 had given fellatio to her pimp, which wasn't satisfying enough, he would beat her up, yelling at her that she was worthless and that it was her fault he was so upset. If X1's abusers found out that she had given out signals of her abuse to the outside world, another girl would be tortured in front of her eyes. During the torture, the perpetrators would scream at her that this was all her fault and would put her face into the other girl's blood. X1 then had to ask forgiveness to the other girl. Even when X1's best friend was raped and murdered in front of her eyes, probably because this girl became too old, she was the one to blame. In most cases, X1 was blamed for things she had absolutely no control over. The same thing happened to many other girls in the network. For the abusers, it was a way to destroy the victim's self-esteem and confidence, making them perfect sex slaves and objects for sadistic torture. I must warn you, what you are about to hear is somewhat brief, yet deeply disturbing. Besides the psychological indoctrination, X1 and the other victims reported to have undergone a whole range of other traumatic experiences. A session of violent anal sex at age 3 certainly would fit into that category, as would being raped by dogs at age 4. But there also were the ice-cold showers, the long and painful tie-downs, the many beatings, rapes with knives and scissors, and the torture with razor blades. Besides being raped by dogs, X1 also spoke about how Bernard Weinstein, an associate of Dutroux until murdered by him in 1995, and Annie Bowdy, former girlfriend of Nihul, sometimes walked around with a snake at abuse sessions, which they used to rape the girls with. Sounds hard to believe, doesn't it? However, pictures confirming this sort of abuse were confiscated from a child abuse network and appeared in the Dutroux dossier. Another example, according to Regina, happened to her in Noke when she was 10 years old. When the contractions started, X1's grandmother made a phone call. The Lippens brothers, Van den Boynants, and the assistant police commissioner of Noke arrived. Ibn Voisin and Van der Elst arrived thereafter. Van der Elst puts a knife on her throat, while Ben Voisin rapes her. She must masturbate while Van der Elst makes a number of photos. Lippen rapes her with a razor blade. When the baby exited, Ibn Voisin beat X1 multiple times in the face. Directly after X1 gave birth, she was raped and sodomized. Her daughter disappeared 6 weeks later. What's there to say about this piece of testimony? These events sound absolutely unbelievable, but the names and details have been repeated by other independent witnesses. Regina also frequently spoke about the end circuit, in which many girls tended to end up by the time they reached their 16th birthday. Growing too old, not going along with the abuse, or failing to satisfy a customer, according to Regina, this could all lead to a child prostitute's untimely death. X1, X2, X3, X4, and many other witnesses all spoke about children being murdered. These murders were often captured on video, which were subsequently shown at a number of abuse parties. Besides the already powerful statements from witnesses, there was also some independent evidence that these so-called snuff films, like child abuse networks, are more than just an urban myth, as they are usually referred to. In May of 2004, an English-language magazine that reports on EU affairs located in Brussels, called The Sprout, published a report claiming that 8-year-old Julie and Melissa didn't actually die of starvation, but had been killed in a snuff film, and that a number of prominent people had been present at this murder. Two of the most prominent names in the X dossiers, Paul van den Boynants and Baron Benoit de Benvoisin. Van den Boynants was accused by X1, X3, and X4 of being a violent child abuser and or a person involved in hunts on children. Another victim, Natalie W., claimed to have seen Van den Boynants at the Dolo, favorite club of Nihul, while X2 testified she had seen Van den Boynants' private driver there, Henri Biel, talking to one of Belgium's most notorious gangsters, Madani Buhush. X1 has named both Biel and Buhush as child abusers. On a lesser note, Van den Boynants' name also appeared in the Pinion file of the 1980s and in Maud Sarr's TV testimony in February 1990, in which his name came up alongside a DEA-trained gendarme general with whom he once ran a massive drug importing operation. Both the Pinion and Maud Sarr cases were about a prostitution network in which minors were used to blackmail high-ranking officials. X1 and X2 mentioned de Benvoisin as one of the most sadistic abusers in the network. One of his sisters married Count Hervé de Ursel, who has been accused by X1 of involvement in the snuff and ritual abuse network. One of his sisters married Count Hervé de Ursel, who has been accused by X1 of involvement in the snuff and ritual abuse network. His other sister is married to Bernard Dimmerod, an intelligence-connected family which has been accused of child abuse and Satanism by X4 and Natalie W. X2 mentioned having been at a meeting organized by her pimp, at which Dimmerod, de Ursel, and de Benvoisin families were all present together with the Prince and Princess of Chimay. According to X2, hunts on children were organized in the woods of Château de Chimay. As if things weren't already strange enough, I happened to find an article published July 20th, 2021 with the title Belgian Gladio and the Dutroux Affair, which perfectly illustrates the connections linking Dutroux and Nihul to the upper echelons of Belgian politics. Dutroux wouldn't go to trial until 2004, nearly 8 years after his original arrest, where he asserted that he was a low-level functionary in an extensive child trafficking network, with Jean-Michel Nihul being responsible for directing his kidnappings. Dutroux would be sentenced to life in prison, the maximum possible sentence for his crimes. Michel Nihul, on the other hand, was acquitted of any involvement in child trafficking and instead sentenced to 5 years in prison for conspiracy and drug trafficking, only to be released after merely 2 years of imprisonment. This incredibly light sentencing makes sense in the context of who Nihul knew. One of the judges initially involved in the Dutroux case, Jean-Claude Van Espen, was a close associate of Nihul's, and Jean-Michel Nihul was also an informant for the Bijonder Opsporingsbrigade, a branch of the Belgian gendarmerie that functioned as a rough equivalent to the American Federal Bureau of Investigations. Between this and the fact that many of the witnesses who implicated Nihul also implicated the involvement of powerful politicians and officials, the Brussels businessman was given an absurdly light sentence. Only a few years after his release in 1999, Nihul himself would tell the German newspaper Der Spiegel in 2001, "I control the government. Everyone has compromising dossiers on one another to be used as leverage in the right situation," even offering off the record to provide a videotape of Belgium's King Albert II assaulting a teenage girl for a six-figure sum. Nihul died a free man at the age of 78 in 2019. Having gone over these horrific crimes and the high likelihood of a cover-up on the part of the government, it is time to go deeper by looking at how these crimes connect to the deep politics of Belgium. 5 important names: Paul van den Boynants, Baron Benoit de Benvoisin, Ladani Buhush, Leon Francois, and Marshal Lequeux were all either implicated in the Dutroux-Nihul child abuse ring by victim witnesses or accused of child sexual abuse by sources whose testimonies aligned with the aforementioned victim witnesses. What makes these names particularly interesting to us is that they also all have connections to the Belgian fascist underground. Paul van den Boynants, former Prime Minister of Belgium, was a member of the notoriously reactionary Catholic organization Opus Dei, a vocal supporter of NATO, and in 1969 would be one of the founders of the Cercle des Nations, a right-wing anti-communist and pro-NATO exclusive social club composed of a small number of elites who gave their public support to the dictatorships of Augusto Pinochet, Francisco Franco, and Antonio Salazar. It's likely not a coincidence that over a dozen Cercle des Nations members would be implicated in the Dutroux affair. Later in 1971, Boynants would also found the Nouvelle Europe magazine, a publication that would serve as a platform for the organization of fascist paramilitary NEM clubs. In the foundation of both the Cercle des Nations and the Nouvelle Europe magazine, Boynants had a partner in Baron Benoit de Benvoisin, aka the Black Baron, another member of the Opus Dei who would play a vital role in fundraising for Boynants. Besides his work directly with Boynants, in 1973, Benvoisin would fund the creation of the Front de la Jeunesse, a fascist organization formed out of the NEM clubs, to which he appointed his advisor Francis de Sonia as the leader. A year later, in 1974, Benvoisin would play a key role in funding the Public Information Office, a branch of Belgian military intelligence that worked closely with private intelligence groups and was headed by Jean-Marie Bougerot. Through these connections, Benvoisin linked mainstream right-wing politicians like Boynants to outright fascist paramilitaries, as well as to the world of private intelligence. Here's where the ties between the mainstream right-wing power network of Boynants and Benvoisin becomes even more obviously tied into the Belgian fascist underground. One of the instructors hired by Benvoisin to turn the Front de la Jeunesse into an effective fighting force was one Madani Buhush, a member of the Belgian gendarmerie who worked as a part of the CIA-trained National Bureau of Drugs, an organization created under the direction of then Prime Minister Paul van den Boynants and General Leon Francois, and who apparently was a close associate of Michel Nihul, frequenting many of the same clubs together. During the 1980s, Buhush would be a primary suspect in the Brabant killings, an unsolved terrorist attack. Furthermore, according to Gendarmerie officer Marshal Lequeux, he and Buhush were members of a fascist organization inside of the Gendarmerie known as Group G, with intentions of destabilizing the Belgian state and securing power for the far right. Lequeux would identify one of the key leaders of Group G as none other than the aforementioned General Leon Francois. For his part, Francois had founded and served as the initial head of the National Bureau of Drugs with the support of the CIA, and in 1990, years before the Dutroux affair, had been accused along with Boynants of participating in drug-fueled orgies with underage girls. These 5 men, Boynance, Bonvoisin, Bohush, Lequeux, and Francois were not only all accused of involvement in the sexual abuse and trafficking of children, with Boynance and Bohush being specifically identified as associates of Michel Nihoul, but also were all involved in a fascist conspiracy, an extension of the American-backed Operation Gladio. For those who aren't aware, Operation Gladio was the code name for the Italian branch of a series of stay-behind paramilitary networks set up after the end of World War II, which has been used as a shorthand for this series of networks as a whole throughout Western Europe, as well as countries such as Turkey. Overseen by NATO and the CIA, Gladio was set up in anticipation of an invasion by the Warsaw Pact and in line with its anti-communist intentions, heavily recruited from former fascists. In Italy, these American-backed neo-fascist secret armies would be responsible for the years of lead from the late 1960s to early 1980s, carrying out numerous terrorist attacks, including many which were intended as false flags to be blamed on leftist elements. The equivalent of Gladio in Belgium has been less well documented than its Italian counterpart, but still leaves behind a violent legacy and was certainly no less fascist than any of its parallel operations. The Documentation, Information, and Action Service 8, or SDRA 8, was the Belgian military branch of the Gladio stay-behind networks set up by American and British intelligence, along with the Joint Civilian Branch of Belgian Gladio, or STC-MOB. It is a matter of record that the SDRA-8 would be used to carry out false flag attacks to discredit the Belgian communist movement, as can be seen from a cursory examination of the 1984 Vielsalm incident, in which American Special Forces and Belgian secret soldiers engaged in a raid on a police station in the small town of Vielsalm, stealing weapons from the cache and killing a warrant officer. Curiously, some of those stolen weapons would turn up in the apartment belonging to the nominally left-wing terrorist group, the Communist Combatant Cells, suggesting that, like in Italy, elements of Gladio were posing as left-wing terror organizations in order to carry out attacks that would hurt the reputation of Belgian communists. False flag terrorist attacks certainly fit the Gladio playbook, and this would have coincided with a series of attacks being carried out around the same time period. Brabant massacres, a series of mysterious terrorist attacks carried out in the province of Brabant from between 1981 and 1985, in which 28 people were murdered at seemingly random locations, including restaurants and grocery stores, as if deliberately designed to provoke general panic. Researchers looking into the Brabant killings found that the most likely culprit for the killings was a fascist paramilitary organization known as the Westland New Post, which had been formed in 1981 within the Front de Légionnais, itself the brainchild of Baron de Bonvoisin. The leader of the Front de Légionnais, Francis de Sonia, would confirm that the Westland New Post had not only been formed out of the front, but also out of the circle of fascist infiltrators within the Belgian gendarmerie known as Group G, which was run by the CIA-backed General Leon Francois. The commander of the Westland New Post would be Paul Latinus, a fascist who had been recruited by the United States Defense Intelligence Agency back in the late 1960s and trained by NATO before being recruited by the Boynance and Bonvoisin-backed Public Information Office headed by Jean-Marie Bougerel, a member of the SDRA-8. Between the training of Latinus under U.S. intelligence and NATO, his employment by a member of Belgian stay-behind networks, and his membership in a secret fascist sect within the gendarmerie, led by a general handpicked by the CIA, the Westland New Post makes itself known as an obvious extension of the terror networks created by Operation Gladio. The claim that the Westland New Post was behind the Brabant massacres was asserted by Marshal Lequeux, a former member of both Group G and the Westland New Post, who asserted that the original purpose of the killings was to create an atmosphere of fear in Belgium and to blame the attacks on the left. Westland New Post member Michel Libier would corroborate Lecqueux's claims of the WNP's responsibility for the killings, describing how he would be sent to scope out grocery stores by Latinus prior to the attacks. It's also worth noting that one of Libier's main contacts and the close associate of the WNP was Madani Buhush, the close associate of Michel Nihoul. Towards the end of the Brabant massacres, WNP leader Paul Latinus would supposedly commit suicide in 1984 under mysterious circumstances, dead from strangulation with his telephone cord wrapped around his neck, with other members of the Westland New Post expressing skepticism that this had really been a suicide. Shortly after the end of the Brabant killings in 1986, Madani Buhush would be arrested for the murder of Juan Mendez, a weapons engineer who believed that Buhush had stolen firearms from him for use in the Brabant killings. By 1988, however, Buhush would be released, even after having been caught trying to break out of jail with the help of the WNP. So there you have it, an overview of the vast web that connects the Brabant killings to Operation Gladio and the Belgian fascist underground, and in turn, the Dutroux-Nihoul child trafficking ring that includes some of the most powerful figures in Belgian politics. This overview of Operation Gladio's involvement in Belgian politics, as well as its key players and connections to child abuse and human trafficking rings, couldn't possibly include every detail of this extensive network and its many appendages. Among the threads not touched on in this article have been Dutroux's connections to the mysterious occult organization Institut Abersax, the involvement of pan-Europeanist National Bolshevik Jean-Francois Thuriart and the infamous Wackenhut Corporation in Belgian Gladio, which has deep ties to the CIA, the BCCI scandal, and Danny Casollero's Octopus, and the Jonestown-esque case of the Order of the Solar Temple cult, who allegedly committed an act of revolutionary mass suicide in 1994. This outline should be considered as a blueprint for understanding matters of deep politics. It's certainly easy to see the similarities between the activities of Jean-Michel Nihoul and, say, Jeffrey Epstein, including their connections to intelligence apparatuses. Furthermore, it should be taken as a warning that returns to traditional values are some sort of antidote to pervasive networks of abuse like this, where it becomes clear that traditionalist institutions like Opus Dei have empowered these architects of systemic abuse. Awareness of this hidden layer of politics can both clarify the operations of the state and the power elite, even as significant amounts of information remain unavailable to us. Studying these sorts of networks of power can often impart a feeling of a total lack of political agency, without a doubt, but at the same time, such study is a necessary first step. In order to take effective action, we must begin by endeavoring to understand what we are taking action against and how this Leviathan operates. How long can we stand idly by while the true intentions of our ruling class remain beyond the veil of public scrutiny? Endless examples of the deliberate demise of our social ethics, intentionally unraveling the moral fabric and placing us on a path to complete societal collapse. False narratives, consistently disseminated through the hidden hand of clandestine operators designed to conceal the very existence of the deep state. What freedom are we to find when we are enslaved under the chains of human trafficking? How do we finally expose and eradicate these depraved patterns of behavior inherently perpetuating the sadistic cycle of abuse? This week, we catch another glimpse of what lies beneath, as we stumble upon a window into the shadowy global elite, shedding light on the undeniable exploitation of the most vulnerable among us. In our effort to draw back the curtain of deception intended to disguise the true dynamics of power, we're confronted with the active suppression of the most formidable evil. The Beast of Belgium serves as a symbol of the malignant cancer disrupting all of global society, ultimately revealing a system that intentionally punishes victims and protects predators.